Hello, everyone, and welcome back to my little corner of the internet. It's always so lovely to see you all tuning in. Now, I know last week I promised you a story that was a little less about knitting and a little more about intrigue. You see, even a 70-year-old woman like me, nestled here in my comfortable armchair, has had her moments of high-stakes drama. Moments that, looking back, feel less like real life and more like a binge-worthy limited series. So settle in, because this one takes us back a full half-century to the summer of 1975, when I was a fledgling adult of 20 and my little sister, Ava, was a vibrant, perpetually exasperated 15. That summer the world felt a little softer, a little slower, but our neighborhood, Willow Creek, was a place humming with its own quiet rhythm. The air was thick with the scent of freshly cut grass and the distant, reassuring sound of sprinklers, a soundtrack to a seemingly perfect suburban life. We lived in a charming, slightly too small house that always smelled faintly of lemon polish and my mother's excellent apple pie. Our sanctuary, though, was guarded by a magnificent, slightly tyrannical ginger cat named Marmalade. Marmalade was more than a pet. He was a founding member of our family ecosystem. He possessed an almost human air of sophisticated disdain, reserving his affection for truly worthy moments, like the exact second you settled onto the sofa with a new book. He was my cat, really, a birthday gift on my 10th birthday, but in the way only cats can, he managed to make Ava believe he was her secret confidant, too. He was a creature of absolute routine. Sunrise meant a brisk, demanding tap on my bedroom door, and sunset meant he would be settled either on the porch swing or, more often, splayed out on the cool tile of the kitchen floor, awaiting his dinner. His predictability was, ironically, the one constant in our otherwise tumultuous house. I was 20 that summer, perched precariously between my childhood home and the daunting unknown of my adult life. I had just finished my second year of college studying literature and was filled with the kind of intellectual arrogance only a 20-year-old can possess. I was mapping out my future, a life of books, quiet contemplation, and perhaps a small, chic apartment in the city. Ava, on the other hand, was a force of pure kinetic energy. She was all angular limbs and intense, rapidly shifting emotions, grappling with the profound injustices of being 15. Her world was a kaleidoscope of rock music, cryptic phone calls with friends, and the deeply serious business of navigating high school politics. We were sisters, but at those ages we often felt like ships passing in the night, connected only by the sheer accident of our shared DNA and, of course, by Marmalade. The day everything shifted started like any other. The sun was streaming through my curtains, and I was in that blissful, half-awake state, contemplating the day's primary goal, which was likely the completion of a challenging crossword puzzle. I remember noticing the lack of a sound before I registered any presence. The usual insistent, proprietary meow that accompanied Marmalade's morning door tap was conspicuously absent. I dismissed it at first. Perhaps, I thought, he was enjoying a rare moment of feline solitude outside. I finally dragged myself out of bed and made my way downstairs. The coffee machine was sputtering its morning greetings, and Ava was already at the kitchen table, glowering into a bowl of dry cereal, wearing her favorite oversized T-shirt from a band I pretended to understand. It was when I reached for Marmalade's empty, pristine food bowl that a tiny shard of ice settled in my stomach. "Has anyone seen Marmalade?" I asked, trying to inject a lightness into my tone that I didn't feel. Ava looked up, her 15-year-old cynicism momentarily replaced by a flicker of genuine curiosity. "No. I thought he was sleeping on your bed. He was on the windowsill when I went to sleep. That was the first deviation from his ironclad routine. Marmalade never missed breakfast. Never." He viewed the morning meal with the seriousness of a military parade. I checked the usual spots, under the sofa, in the laundry basket, even inside the seldom-used fireplace, earning only a puzzled look from my mother, who had just entered the room. A strange, almost suffocating quiet had fallen over the house, a quiet amplified by the absence of his gentle purring or the rhythmic thump of his tail. I went outside, stepping onto the front porch. I called his name, my voice sounding strained and thin in the morning air. I walked around the perimeter of the house, looking under every shrub and behind every flower pot. Nothing. A cold, heavy knot began to form in my chest. It was unlike him to wander. He considered his territorial boundaries a sacred, invisible fence, and straying from them was beneath his dignity. I returned inside, and the atmosphere in the kitchen had subtly changed. Ava, sensing my growing distress, had abandoned her cereal and was now peering out the back window with a furrowed brow. My mother, pragmatic as always, attempted to offer reasonable explanations. Perhaps a playful squirrel had led him astray. Perhaps a neighbor had accidentally locked him in a garage. But the conviction in her voice was lacking. I stood there, a 20-year-old suddenly feeling 12 again, overwhelmed by a primal protective instinct. This was not a misplaced object. This was a missing piece of our home. It wasn't until I happened to glance at the corkboard near the phone that the first real tremor of unease hit me. Tacked to the board, a piece of paper I hadn't noticed before, was a small, hastily written notice. It was from Mrs. Henderson, a sweet elderly woman who lived 3 houses down and whose ancient beagle, Barnaby, was a local institution. The note simply stated in elegant, slightly shaky handwriting that Barnaby had been missing since the day before yesterday. Mrs. Henderson offered a small reward and a heartfelt plea for any information. I stared at the note, then back at Ava. Her eyes, usually darting and impatient, were now focused and grave, fixed on the same piece of paper. The absence of marmalade was no longer an isolated incident. It was beginning to look like a pattern. A tiny seed of something dark and unsettling had been planted in the quiet, sun-drenched predictability of Willow Creek. We had always seen our neighborhood as a bubble of safety, but suddenly the glass had developed a crack, and we were looking out onto something entirely unfamiliar. I could feel the detective stirring within me, a part I never knew existed, and beside me, I could tell by the set of her shoulders, Ava felt it too. The chase, the mystery, had begun. We convened what I grandly termed an emergency investigative session, in the only place that offered us both maximum privacy and easy access to snacks, the slightly dusty, perpetually cool basement. We settled onto a moth-eaten sofa near the old wooden workbench which became our makeshift command center. I retrieved a large, unused piece of poster board from an art supply box, and Ava, with her characteristic tech savviness, even for 1975, grabbed a set of colored markers. The mission was clear. We had to find out if there were more than just 2 missing pets. My first task was to create a basic hand-drawn map of Willow Creek. It was rough, detailing only the main street, our house, and the immediately surrounding neighbors. Ava, meanwhile, was tasked with gathering intelligence. She was naturally more outgoing than I was, possessing a kind of fearless, direct manner that allowed her to ask blunt questions without apology. I instructed her to start with the nearest houses, using the pretext of simply looking for marmalade, but paying close attention to any mention of a missing pet. We split up our neighborhood canvassing. I took the northern loop, toward the more established, quieter houses where the residents tended to keep to themselves. Ava took the southern route, where the families were younger and where gossip, both good and bad, traveled faster. Before we left, we established a coded phrase for any alarming discovery, a theatrical, Did you remember to water the geraniums? Would signal immediate danger or a major breakthrough? My initial conversations were disheartening. I knocked on doors, described Marmalade, showed a hastily drawn sketch of his ginger glory, and received polite, sympathetic shrugs. I spoke to Mr. Peterson, who was obsessed with his lawn. He recalled seeing a cat, but couldn't confirm it was ours. I spoke to Mrs. Jenkins, who was too busy arguing with her poodle, Muffin, to offer any real insight. It felt like I was searching for a ripple in a perfectly smooth pond. It wasn't until I reached the end of my loop, at the home of the very kind and talkative Mrs. Miller, that I hit pay dirt. I introduced myself, explained Marmalade's disappearance, and Mrs. Miller immediately lowered her voice to a conspiratorial whisper. She looked genuinely distressed. "Oh, dearie," she said, wringing her hands, "I'm so terribly sorry to hear that. You know, just last week my grandniece's little terrier, Dot, went missing. The little white one just vanished right out of the yard. She thought it was just bad luck. But now, you, Mrs. Henderson, and Dot—" A shiver went up my spine. Barnaby, a beagle. Dot, a terrier. Marmalade, a cat. Different species, different sizes, all gone without a trace. I asked her a few gentle questions, trying to keep the panic out of my voice. Did anyone see anything unusual? Any strange cars? Any unfamiliar faces? Mrs. Miller thought hard, then recalled only a dusty, older model blue van she hadn't recognized, parked down the street for a suspiciously long time 2 evenings ago. It was a flimsy lead, but it was something. I hurried back home, my pace quickening with every step. When I got back to the command center, Ava was already there, pacing, a ferocious look of determination on her face. Her side of the street had been far more productive and far more alarming. "Rose," she said, not even bothering with a greeting, "it's bad, really bad." She pointed to the poster board, where she had started drawing small symbols, a little cat icon, a beagle icon, and now a few more. A small cocker spaniel named Buster from the Smith family, a talkative parrot named Patches belonging to old Mr. Wilson, and, most shocking, the purebred Siamese cat Suki from the wealthy side of the neighborhood. 5 confirmed missing pets in a 2-block radius, all within the last 10 days. Everyone I talked to had the same story, Ava explained, tapping a marker on the board. No witnesses, no barking, just gone. The Smiths thought Buster just got off his leash, but Mrs. Smith said he never goes past the driveway. And get this, the only common thread anyone could think of was a guy they saw occasionally, not a local. Mid-40s, wearing a plain dark baseball cap, always carrying a large dark duffel bag. He was seen asking kids about their pets' feeding habits near the park entrance. My heart hammered against my ribs. A blue van, a stranger with a duffel bag, 5 distinct missing pets. This wasn't a case of animals wandering off. This was a calculated, deliberate act. This was a racket. We realized that the sheer variety of the missing animals, a valuable Siamese, a beloved family mutt, an exotic parrot, a beagle, and our magnificent common ginger cat, suggested the motive might not be the typical pet theft for resale. If it were a purely financial operation, they would only target the expensive, purebred animals. The inclusion of Barnaby and Marmalade, simple, deeply loved family pets, changed the picture. What kind of person would steal an ordinary ginger cat? "We need a system," I announced, pulling 2 clean notebooks from a shelf. "We need to track the details, location, date last seen, and any strange sightings." We worked for the next hour, poring over the map. I drew little X's on the houses of the owners, and we realized the disappearances were forming a concentric circle, almost like a predator was slowly tightening the net around a central area. The houses with the missing pets were all connected by a series of quiet back alleys and overgrown public pathways, pathways rarely used by the main neighborhood traffic. "The pathways," Ava murmured, tracing a finger across the map. "They're using the walkways, quick in, quick out. Nobody sees a car parked on the main street." We agreed on our next steps. We couldn't go to the police yet. We had zero proof, only circumstantial sightings and worried neighbors. The police would likely dismiss it as a coincidence or a sudden localized uptick in animals running away. We had to find something concrete. The blue van Mrs. Miller mentioned, and the suspicious man with the duffel bag, were our only real leads. I decided to stake out the area around the back alleys we had identified, starting that evening, focusing on where the man was reported to have been seen. Near the old, unused entrance to the Willow Creek Nature Preserve, it was a wooded, secluded spot, perfect for covert activities. Ava, meanwhile, was going to focus on building a more detailed timeline, checking with the owners of Dot, Buster, and Patches to confirm the exact time of disappearance. We needed to identify a pattern. Were they taken in the morning, the evening, or late at night? Before leaving the basement, I looked at Ava. She had traded her usual look of teenage angst for one of determined, almost fierce concentration. We weren't just sisters anymore. We were partners, united by a serious, urgent cause. The lightness of the summer had evaporated, replaced by the weight of a shared secret and a shared mission. We grabbed 2 heavy-duty flashlights and headed back upstairs, ready to walk straight into the dark heart of the Willow Creek mystery. The silence of the missing marmalade had finally been broken by the loud, relentless thumping of our investigative hearts. Our investigation had progressed from a worried search for a missing cat to a full-blown pursuit of a criminal ring. The reality of the danger was starting to sink in, but so was the exhilaration of the chase. I looked at Ava, and she met my gaze with a look of shared, fierce determination. We were 2 amateur detectives against a professional racket, and in that dimly lit basement, we knew our next move had to be our riskiest yet. We had to find the van itself. The trail was faint, but it was there, leading us directly into the greater mystery that lay just beyond the comfort of Willow Creek. The ghost hour discovery in the basement was a seismic shift in our investigation. It provided structure and logic to what had seemed like random acts of theft. We weren't chasing ghosts, we were chasing a schedule. Our focus now narrowed to one central, tangible piece of evidence: the blue van. The van was their mobile command center, their transport, and perhaps the key to finding their temporary holding spot. The problem was that Willow Creek, while lovely, was only one small spoke on the wheel of a larger metropolitan area. Finding one older blue van in a city filled with thousands of vehicles was like looking for a single grain of sand on the beach. But we had to start somewhere, and our only geographical advantage was the area surrounding the nature preserve entrance. We hypothesized that their base had to be within a manageable driving distance from their theft zone, accessible via quiet back roads. The next morning, we decided to dedicate the entire day to mapping out the van's potential routes. We split our territories again, but this time our movements were far more deliberate. I took my bicycle, a sturdy, slightly rusty 10-speed, and headed west, toward the industrial edges of the city, a place known for low-rent warehouses and forgotten storage facilities. Ava, with her superior neighborhood knowledge and network of friends, took the residential areas to the east, meticulously checking side streets, abandoned lots, and the parking areas of quiet strip malls. My journey was a deep dive into the unfamiliar, the parts of the city that felt gritty and uninviting. I pedaled past dusty lumber yards, shuttered factories, and rows of identical, anonymous storage units. I kept my eyes peeled for any vehicle that matched the vague description: older model, utilitarian, and most importantly, blue. I made sure to pay attention to the vehicles parked long-term, gathering dust, not the ones zipping past. The hours dragged on, each empty street offering the same blank slate. The sun beat down, turning my shirt damp and my task monotonous. I found myself thinking about Marmalade, picturing his confused, indignant face, and that fueled my legs. I imagined Ava was having better luck, leveraging her social connections, perhaps stopping to talk to a few of the older, nosy residents who sat on their porches all day, the true silent sentinels of the neighborhood. By mid-afternoon, I was about to give up on the industrial area when I spotted something promising. Tucked away behind a small, independent auto repair shop, partially obscured by a leaning stack of bald tires, was a utility vehicle. It was a faded gray, not blue, but it was an older model. I covertly approached, pretending to examine a flower growing in the weeds, and noticed that the license plate was caked in dried reddish-brown mud. A clear sign it had recently been driven off-road, perhaps exactly where I'd found the tire tracks the night before. I quickly jotted down the partial license plate number and the shop's name. It wasn't the blue van, but it felt like I was getting closer to the periphery of the operation. I headed back toward Willow Creek, eager to compare notes with Ava. I found her back in the basement, hunched over the map, her expression a mix of frustration and excitement. She had circles and arrows drawn across the eastern side of the map, and a triumphant grin slowly spread across her face as I walked in. "I found it, Rose," she announced, her voice barely a whisper, thick with discovery. "I found the spot." She explained that she hadn't found the van itself, but rather a pattern of sightings related to the man with the duffel bag. She'd spoken to a group of her friends who lived near the busy Route 12 highway. One of them mentioned that her older brother, who worked an early morning paper route, had reported seeing a strange vehicle almost every morning around 7 a.m., always parked near the old abandoned feed mill on the edge of the wetlands, about 2 miles from our neighborhood. "It's a blue van, Rose," Ava emphasized, pointing to a small, isolated area on the map, far from any residential homes. He said it was dull, faded blue, and always covered in dust, parked there for about an hour, and then it drives off toward the city. The pieces immediately clicked into place. The ghost hour thefts happen in Willow Creek, 8:45 p.m. to 10:15 p.m. The van drives the stolen pets to a temporary location. Then, the next morning, the van drives from that temporary location to the main distribution point in the city around 7 a.m. The feed mill, an abandoned large building near the highway, was the perfect short-term holding facility, isolated enough to hide their activity, close enough for a quick getaway from the theft zone. I shared my information about the gray van and the auto repair shop. We decided the gray van was probably a secondary vehicle, perhaps used for reconnaissance or moving smaller supplies, while the blue van was the main transport for the animals. The repair shop was likely just a place to keep their vehicles running quietly and off the radar. It added a layer of professionalism to the racket. They weren't just common thieves. They had logistics, maintenance, and a system. We had a location, the old feed mill. We had a time, the morning window, 6:30 a.m. to 7:30 a.m. The thought of going to the mill filled me with a sudden chilling dread. The nature preserve woods were one thing, but an isolated, probably structurally unsound, abandoned mill near a major highway felt like a place where things truly vanished. But Marmalade was there, or had been recently. That knowledge overcame the fear. We had to act on the morning window immediately, before another load of stolen pets was transported away. This memory is always accompanied by the crisp, biting air of that pre-dawn morning. At 20, I had a tendency toward melodrama. Yet even I recognized that this was the most serious, most dangerous thing I had ever undertaken. The old feed mill, sitting on the desolate outskirts of Willow Creek, was a fortress of forgotten industry, and I was about to breach its walls. I left the house well before sunrise, navigating the quiet, dewy streets on my bicycle. The air was heavy and cold, the kind of stillness that precedes great effort. My father's heavy, single-lens reflex camera was slung across my chest, feeling less like a tool for evidence and more like a cumbersome stone. Next to it, in my pocket, the small can of pepper spray provided a purely psychological comfort. I felt impossibly small and exposed, a tiny shadow against the vast, sleeping city. When I finally reached the old feed mill, my breath hitched. Ava's information was chillingly accurate. It was a massive, skeletal structure made of dark brick and corrugated iron, rising 3 stories high. Its windows were either broken or boarded up, giving it a vacant, menacing expression. The smell was industrial, a mix of damp concrete, old grain, and something metallic. The entire property was enclosed by a chain-link fence, rusting and draped with thorny vines, but a section near the back had been cleanly cut and temporarily secured with a simple wire twist. This was the entry point. I secured my bike behind a thick stand of wild cottonwoods and approached the perimeter on foot, moving with a silent stealth I didn't know I possessed. I felt the surge of adrenaline sharpen every sense. The slightest snap of a twig sounded like a gunshot. I found a vantage point behind a dense thicket of bushes about 25 yards from the mill's loading dock, and there it was, the faded blue van. It was parked against the loading dock, its rear doors facing the mill. It was older, dented, and caked in the same reddish-brown dust I'd noticed in the tire tracks near the nature preserve. The engine was off, sitting silent and waiting, a beast asleep. Seeing it confirmed everything, yet the confirmation brought not relief, but a cold, hard fear. This was real. I settled in, the silence around the mill absolute, save for the distant low moan of a truck passing on the highway. I held the binoculars up, the lenses magnifying the texture of the van's paint and the grime on the windows. Then the silence broke. The first sign of life came from inside the mill. A single bare light bulb flickered on over the loading dock, casting a sickly yellow pool of light against the oppressive darkness. Then a door creaked open, and the men appeared. There were 2 of them. They perfectly matched the description Ava had collected, middle-aged, unremarkable in height and build, dressed in identical dark work jackets and caps. They moved with a practiced, unsettling efficiency. They were clearly not bothered by the early hour. This was their routine. The first man immediately began backing the blue van flush against the dock. The second man stayed on the dock, and I watched, my stomach twisting, as he began to move the cargo. The cargo was animals. They were not loose. They were confined in a variety of plastic carriers and wire cages, small ones, large ones. I recognized the shape of one carrier that looked suspiciously like a style Mrs. Smith had described for her small dog Buster. The men handled the cages with a casual, almost brutal indifference, not with malice, but with the purely functional detachment of someone moving freight. There was no affection, no acknowledgement of the living creatures inside. They were commodities. I forced my shaking hands to raise the camera. This was the most critical part of the mission. I needed proof. I needed the license plate. My father's camera was notoriously loud. The clack of the shutter was a sound I usually loved, but here it felt like a declaration of war. I waited for a passing semi-truck on the highway to mask the sound, timing my shots precisely. Click, van body, click, the men loading the cages, click, the dirty, clearly visible license plate number. Each click sent a wave of icy panic through me. As the second man turned to go back inside the mill, presumably for another load, I caught the most crucial, heartbreaking glimpse. Stacked near the entrance, awaiting transit, were several cages, and in one of the middle cages, I saw a familiar, magnificent flash of orange fur. It was lying curled up, looking small and defeated. Marmalade. The sight was a physical punch to my gut. He was safe, yes, but he was trapped, reduced from the king of our household to a number in a stack. The sheer relief was immediately replaced by a surge of furious determination. I had him. I knew where he was. Then came the moment of highest peril. As the man turned away, his foot snagged on a loose plank on the loading dock, and he swore, a muffled, harsh sound. He paused, rubbing his ankle, and then slowly his eyes scanned the perimeter. His gaze passed right over my thicket of bushes, lingering just a second too long. I froze, squeezing my eyes shut, not daring to breathe, forcing myself to merge with the shadow. I remembered something from a long-forgotten self-defense course. Stay still, become part of the background, and trust that the human eye is drawn to movement. The man waited, perhaps sensing the slightest irregularity in the morning stillness. Then with a shrug he turned and disappeared back into the mill. It was my cue. I had enough. I had the license plate, the routine, the location, and proof that our pets were inside. I didn't wait for the van to pull out. I knew they would be back the following night, and I couldn't risk being seen. I backed away, not standing up until I had reached the safety of the cottonwoods, and then scrambled back to my bicycle. The ride home was a blur of adrenaline and triumph. The fear was still there, a knot in my stomach, but it was overshadowed by the exhilarating realization that we had them. We had crossed the line from speculation to evidence. I burst into the kitchen. Ava was already there, making coffee, expecting my return. I didn't have to say a word. The wildness in my eyes, the grime on my jacket, and the sweat-streaked lens of the camera were all the confirmation she needed. I hurried her down to the basement command center. In the dim light, I laid the camera on the workbench. My hands were still shaking as I opened the back and began to meticulously peel out the film. "The ghost hour," I whispered, the words hoarse. "It's their delivery window. They load them up between 6:30 and 7:30 a.m. for transport. It's organized, Ava. They're professionals." Ava's eyes were glued to the roll of film. She understood the weight of that tiny plastic cylinder. It held the proof that would dismantle this operation and bring Marmalade home. Our focus shifted from where they were to what they were doing with them. Why were they stealing common pets alongside expensive ones? That answer, I knew, was the true core of the racket, and it was the next, most dangerous puzzle piece we had to find. The basement air, usually cool and dusty, now felt charged with a palpable, crackling tension. We were holding the smoking gun, or rather, the undeveloped film that contained the smoking gun. The morning had truly begun. But for us, time was suspended between the darkness of the stakeout and the revelation hidden on that film. Our first task was getting the photographs developed without drawing any attention. Going to the usual drugstore photo lab would have been foolish. The cashier might recognize the location, or worse, the content of the pictures. This was 1975, and surveillance was a manual chemical process. Fortunately, my father, an avid hobbyist photographer, had a small, mostly forgotten darkroom set up in a dusty utility closet adjacent to the basement, a perfect self-contained sanctuary for conspiracy. Ava, though younger, had absorbed more of my father's technical knowledge, and under her guidance we began the tedious, precise process of development. The closet was small, hot, and smelled strongly of chemicals. We worked in near silence, the only sounds being the careful sloshing of the developing tanks and Ava's focused, whispered instructions. The air was thick with anticipation. Finally, we reached the stage where we could examine the wet negatives under the red safety light. The relief was immediate and profound. The images were clear: the blue van, the loading dock, the two men in their dark jackets. It was all there. And most importantly, there was a perfectly readable close-up shot of the van's license plate number. We hung the damp prints to dry, but the most crucial evidence we had was already captured in the negative's detail. We took the images into the command center, spreading them out on the workbench under the harsh glare of a clip-on lamp. "Look at the cages," I instructed Ava, pointing to a close-up of the loading. "Notice anything specific about the animals they are putting in the van?" We scrutinized the photographic evidence. There was a Persian cat, certainly valuable. There was a specific breed of small hound dog, but mixed right alongside them were pets we knew to be simple mutts, or common cats, like our Marmalade and Barnaby. "The variety is too random for a pure breeding or resale ring," Ava mused, tapping her pencil on the photo of the men. "If they wanted purebreds, they wouldn't risk taking a common ginger cat. The risk-to-reward ratio is too low." We pondered this inconsistency, the why, which was the key that unlocked the entire racket. If not money, then what? The answer came to me with the sudden, almost terrifying clarity of a lightning strike, drawn from my college studies and a recent sensational news article Ava had shown me about animal testing regulations. "It's experimental supply," I whispered, the words sounding hollow and awful in the small room. Ava's eyes widened, understanding instantly. The news had been full of stories about universities and labs struggling to meet the demand for research animals due to tightening regulations on pet sales and increasing public scrutiny. They needed a constant, steady supply of animals of all kinds for various non-specific general research and testing. A pet racket that supplied labs wouldn't discriminate. They would target any animal that was healthy, easily captured, and available in large quantities. A random mix of common and purebred pets would be perfect for filling quotas. The purebreds were a bonus, sold for a higher premium to more specific research branches, while the common pets kept the operation running steadily. It wasn't about the type of pet. It was about the volume of healthy animals they could procure quickly and quietly. The coldness of the motive was far more disturbing than a simple theft for money. It meant our pets were headed not just for a new owner, but potentially for a sterile, harsh existence far worse than being held in a cage. The thought of Marmalade, with his profound dignity, being subjected to any kind of invasive testing, filled me with a sickening resolve. "The license plate," I said, my voice hardening with purpose. "Let's run the license plate. If they are supplying labs, they must be registered, or at least have a registered vehicle. We needed to trace the license plate without involving the police just yet. Going to the authorities now would mean bureaucracy, endless waiting, and the very real risk that the two men would be alerted and simply move the operation, taking the animals with them. We couldn't risk Marmalade being transported during a police investigation. We had to move faster." Ava, with her incredible resourcefulness, recalled that Mr. Jenkins, the poodle owner who had dismissed my questions, was a retired DMV official. He was cranky, yes, but he also had a deeply ingrained respect for the law and an even deeper love for solving bureaucratic puzzles. We reasoned that approaching him, not as an official request, but as a personal favor involving his neighborhood, might work. We drafted a plan. First, Ava would visit Mr. Jenkins, armed with a plate of my mother's famous apple pie and a tale of a friend whose car was stolen by the van and who desperately needed the license information for insurance. Second, I would use the confirmed ghost hour and the loading time to build a detailed timeline for the next 24 hours, predicting their most likely movements. The photographs now felt heavy in my hands, not just as evidence, but as a direct responsibility. We had seen the operation, we had identified the motive, and we now had the key piece of information, the license plate, that would lead us to the operation's ultimate destination. Ava returned an hour later, victorious and miraculously, without the dreaded Jenkins frown. She had charmed him into looking up the plate. The vehicle, as expected, was registered to an anonymous shell corporation located in an adjacent county, but the physical address listed was a large, nondescript commercial building listed as a veterinary supply and research logistics company, the perfect cover for a legitimate-sounding operation that housed and moved research animals. The company's name was Biotech Logistics. This was it. The full picture had emerged. The racket was not two men in a van. It was a sophisticated criminal operation masked by a corporate shell, systematically stealing pets to fuel the cold, relentless demand of the research market. We stared at the address for Biotech Logistics. It was 20 miles outside of Willow Creek, near the city's large medical district. It was far too big, too complex, and too secure for two amateur detectives. We knew we could not perform a rescue mission on this scale. The time for solo investigation was over. We had the evidence, the motive, and the location. Now we had to find the right person to take it to, someone who would believe two young women and act fast. The clock was ticking, and the lives of Marmalade and his companions depended entirely on the next phone call we made. The final terrifying phase of our adventure was about to begin. The name Biotech Logistics hung in the basement air, heavy with the weight of its sinister implications. We had gone from solving a neighborhood disappearance to uncovering an organized criminal enterprise masquerading as a legitimate company. We knew the location, the motive, and the timing, but the problem now was scale. This was not a broken fence we could slip through. This was a fortified corporate building, and any direct attempt at rescue would be reckless, foolish, and likely unsuccessful. We had to bring in the authorities, but that presented a new, immediate dilemma. Who would take two young women seriously, armed with nothing but grainy photographs, a copied license plate number, and a theory about pet napping for research labs? We needed a conduit, an advocate, someone with enough professional gravitas to force the police to act, and act fast, before the next morning's transport occurred. My 20-year-old mind immediately thought of our parents, but that was dismissed almost instantly. Their protective instincts would override any investigative action. They would panic, contact the local police precinct haphazardly, and almost certainly cause the immediate dispersal of the evidence, or worse, put us directly in harm's way. This required precision. It was Ava, ever the pragmatist, who came up with the unlikely solution. "We need to talk to Mr. Harrison," she stated, pointing to a name on our neighborhood phone list. Mr. Harrison lived at the very end of our street. He was a quiet, imposing man in his late 50s, a former investigative journalist for one of the city's largest newspapers, who had recently retired to a life of gardening and silence. He was known for his sharp mind, his aversion to small talk, and a reputation for ruthlessness when chasing a story. He was a man who understood how to navigate the levers of power and media, exactly what we needed. I was nervous. Mr. Harrison had the demeanor of a man who suffered fools poorly, but our mission superseded my shyness. We gathered our evidence: the developed photos showing the blue van and the caged animals, the license plate number, the address and corporate name of Biotech Logistics, and our carefully constructed timeline of the ghost hour thefts. We packed it all into an old large manila envelope. We walked the few blocks to his house. The afternoon sun was warm, but a chill of professional anxiety ran through me. We rang the doorbell, and when Mr. Harrison answered, he gave us a single piercing look that seemed to assess our motives and intelligence instantly. I started to stammer out a polite preamble about a neighborhood issue, But Ava cut me off with the directness only a 15-year-old can muster. "Mr. Harrison, we haven't lost a bicycle. We've uncovered a crime ring that's stealing the neighborhood pets and transporting them for illegal research. We need your help to make the police listen before tomorrow morning." The bluntness of her statement seemed to catch him off guard. He paused, looked from Ava's determined face to my nervous one, and then a flicker of the old investigative fire appeared in his eyes. "Come in," he said simply, leading us to his sunroom, which was overflowing with stacks of newspapers and dusty books. We laid out the entire case, starting with the quiet disappearance of Marmalade and ending with the chilling revelation of biotech logistics. I narrated the stakeout, the precise timing, the identity of the two men, and the heartbreaking sight of the caged animals. Ava detailed the forensic work, the tire tracks, the ghost hour pattern, and the license plate trace through Mr. Jenkins. Mr. Harrison didn't interrupt us once. He listened with an intensity that demanded honesty, occasionally picking up a photo or tapping a finger on the biotech address. When we finished, the silence was heavy. He finally spoke, his voice low and gravelly. "You two have done the work of a seasoned investigative team. This is meticulous, the inclusion of common pets alongside purebreds, the logistics cover. It absolutely points to the illegal animal trade supplying unvetted research labs." His validation felt like a physical weight being lifted from my shoulders. It confirmed that our analysis, born from worry and fueled by determination, was sound. "The police," he continued, "will file this as pet nuisance unless we frame it correctly. They won't believe the research angle immediately. We hit them with the commerce." He explained his plan. "We wouldn't go to the local precinct. Instead, we would contact a former colleague of his who worked on the Metropolitan Task Force, a man who understood large-scale theft and organized crime. Mr. Harrison would present the case not as a plea for missing pets, but as a meticulously documented corporate fraud and illegal commerce operation involving the interstate transport of stolen, high-value inventory. The inclusion of the valuable purebreds and the professional logistics company would demand a higher level of attention and a swifter response." He spent the next hour working the phones, his voice transforming into the authoritative, persuasive baritone of a man accustomed to demanding answers. He meticulously outlined the evidence to his contact, referencing our photos and documents, ensuring the entire operation was treated with the urgency it deserved. He was our firebreak, protecting our anonymity while ensuring the information was taken seriously. When he hung up, he turned to us, his expression sober. "The task force is interested. They've run the license plate and the corporation. It's a known shell company with a history of minor regulatory infractions. They are planning to assemble a team tonight, using your intelligence. They need to get a search warrant and hit the facility before the morning transport window, before 6:30 a.m. The realization of the timeline was terrifying. It was already late afternoon. The window for rescue was less than 12 hours away. Mr. Harrison looked directly at us. "They want to know where you got the photos," he said. We immediately knew what he meant. They needed to confirm that the location was actively being used. We had already agreed that we would not return to the mill. It was too dangerous. But we had to provide that final confirmation. "We have to give them the precise location of the cut in the fence and the loading dock details," Ava whispered. Mr. Harrison nodded, pulling out a large sheet of paper. We spent the next hour drawing a detailed, almost aerial view map of the old feed mill complex, marking the entry point, the specific parking spot of the blue van, and the location of the flickering light bulb, all the details that would guide a swift covert entry team. As we were about to leave, Mr. Harrison stopped us. "You two stay home. You've done your part. You are witnesses now, not participants." We agreed, but the promise felt thin. We had found Marmalade. We knew where he was. The idea of sitting at home while others executed the most critical phase of the plan was unbearable. We left Mr. Harrison's house with a deep sense of accomplishment and a profound gnawing anxiety, knowing that the final decisive action would happen in the early hours of the next morning, and that we would almost certainly not be waiting quietly at home. The directive from Mr. Harrison to stay home and wait was reasonable, professional, and entirely impossible for us to follow. We were 20 and 15, driven by a deep, personal stake in this operation. Marmalade was there. After all the detective work, the fear, and the exhilaration of the chase, the thought of sitting by the phone while the fate of our beloved pet was decided 20 miles away was unbearable. We returned home, consumed by a restless energy. The basement command center, which had felt like a hive of activity, now felt like a cage. We went through the motions of a normal evening, but every casual conversation with our parents felt like a performance of deceit. We ate a silent dinner, feigning tiredness, and retreated to our respective rooms, but we both knew the night was far from over. Ava slipped into my room just after midnight. She didn't knock. She just appeared, a shadow in the doorway, her eyes wide and electric in the moonlight filtering through the window. She was already dressed in dark, quiet clothing. "We can't just wait, Rose," she whispered, her voice tight with conviction. "What if the police miss something? What if they don't find Marmalade? We know exactly where his cage was." I didn't need convincing. The plan had already formed, vague but necessary. We wouldn't interfere with the police operation. That would be dangerous and foolish. We simply had to be nearby. We needed to be witnesses, ready to spot any deviation, any chance for a last-minute escape attempt by the criminals, or to guide the rescue team if necessary. Our new mission, the pre-dawn watch. We quietly gathered our essential gear. The heavy flashlight, its lens now covered with a piece of dark fabric to mute the beam, the field binoculars, and most importantly, a walkie-talkie set Ava had convinced Dad was for emergency neighborhood watch. It was clumsy and prone to static, but it would allow us to maintain a low-profile line of communication during the watch. The logistics of getting to the old feed mill were tricky. It was too far to bike stealthily in the dark, and driving our parents' old station wagon was out of the question. Ava, however, had the foresight to have already solved this. "I called a taxi," she murmured, eyes glinting mischievously. "Told him we had an emergency early morning flight, and he needs to drop us at the far end of the highway near the old industrial park. We just need to walk the last mile." Her boldness, her ability to execute logistics under pressure, never ceased to amaze me. She was 15 and already a masterful planner. We crept out of the house at 1:30 a.m., moving with the practiced quietness of lifelong co-conspirators. The night was cold, clear, and quiet. The cab ride was tense and silent. The driver, thankfully, was more interested in the early morning news radio than in questioning two teenagers with backpacks. He dropped us off at a deserted gas station near the highway entrance, and from there we began our trek along the shoulder of the empty service road that paralleled Route 12. The industrial landscape was eerily silent, the only sound the crunch of gravel under our shoes. We found a new vantage point, a dense, overgrown embankment, overlooking the mill property, from a slightly different angle than my previous stakeout. This spot was about a quarter-mile away, offering more safety and a broader view of the access roads. We settled in, concealed by the thicket of winter-bare sumac bushes, the cold dampness quickly seeping into our clothes. We used the binoculars to scan the mill's perimeter. It was completely dark, silent, and appeared deserted. But then I saw it, the first sign of official activity. A dark, unmarked sedan was parked silently about half a mile down the main access road leading to the mill. Its lights were off, and it was nestled partially behind a billboard. As I watched, a tiny, almost imperceptible flash of light reflected off the driver's side window, a signal, perhaps, or a check of a map. The police task force was in position. Ava and I exchanged a look of pure, shared triumph. Our information was good. They were here. The tension became almost unbearable. We sat in silence for another hour, watching the darkness. The rescue was planned for the period right before the ghost hour shift change, the sweet spot between 3 a.m. and 5 a.m., when the facility would be at its most vulnerable, before the criminals prepared for the morning transport. Around 3:30 a.m., the atmosphere changed. It wasn't a sound, but a shift in the quality of the darkness. I could sense movement. Then, using the binoculars, I spotted the shadows. They weren't moving on the main road. They were moving stealthily through the bordering woods, approaching the mill from the far side, exactly where we had identified the weak spot in the fence. They were dressed in dark, tactical gear. The task force was making its silent approach. This was the moment. The adrenaline surged through me, a bitter, intense taste in my mouth. We pulled out the walkie-talkies, turning them to the lowest possible volume just in case. "Rose," Ava whispered, her voice barely audible over the static. "There's another vehicle." I focused my binoculars where she was pointing, a rarely used gravel road on the far side of the mill. A second, older pickup truck, dark and almost invisible against the mill's wall, was parked in a deeply shadowed corner. It wasn't the blue van, which was still parked at the loading dock. This vehicle seemed to be their escape hatch, a secondary transport, or perhaps belonging to a third, higher-level operative. It hadn't been there during my morning stakeout. We recognized the immense risk this posed. If the police came in hard and fast, the sound could alert the men inside, and they might try to use the secondary vehicle to drive away with some of the more valuable cargo. I knew we had to convey this information immediately. We had Mr. Harrison's direct contact number for emergencies. I pulled out the small notebook and pencil, my hand shaking, and scrawled a note to Ava. "Third vehicle. Backup escape? Give Mr. H a code." Ava nodded, taking the phone, keeping her body low and shielded. She dialed the number Mr. Harrison had given us, the one he promised he would keep nearby. She kept the call brief and cryptic, using the information we'd prepared. "Mr. Harrison, it's the florist. We've spotted a problem with the delivery schedule on the west side. They're using a secondary route." She hung up before he could respond. It was a perfect piece of counterintelligence, vague enough not to compromise him, urgent enough to convey the danger. We had done it. We had passed the final critical piece of intelligence to the rescue team. Now, all we could do was hold our breath and watch the shadows move toward the old dark mill, praying that our efforts and the bravery of the task force would be enough to bring Marmalade and the others safely home before dawn broke. The final decisive hours before dawn were a blur of motion and silence. From our hidden vantage point on the embankment, Ava and I were spectators to a scene of intense covert drama, a silent movie played out under the cold, watchful gaze of the moon. After Ava's brief, cryptic call to Mr. Harrison, we pressed ourselves deeper into the bushes, our eyes glued to the mill. We knew that our warning about the third vehicle might be the deciding factor in the success or failure of the raid. The police were executing a classic pincer maneuver using the intelligence we provided. The main force, having entered through the weak spot in the back fence, approached the building on foot. Hugging the shadows of the mill's vast, unkempt perimeter, they moved like ghosts, professional, silent, and highly coordinated. The tension was suffocating. Every rustle of leaves or distant traffic sound felt amplified. We watched the loading dock area where the blue van stood, a dark monument to their illegal operation. The light inside the dock was still flickering dimly, a beacon in the darkness. Then the action began. It wasn't a loud, chaotic burst as you'd see in the movies. It was a sudden, violent cessation of silence. The primary assault team breached the main loading dock door. There was a dull, heavy thud, the sound of the lock giving way, followed immediately by sharp, shouted commands that cut through the night air. "Police! Freeze!" Simultaneously, the secondary team, alerted to the risk, moved to neutralize the third vehicle, the dark pickup truck Ava had spotted. This was the critical moment. Instead of a direct engagement, which might have led to a high-speed chase or a panicked escape with a load of animals, the secondary team disabled the truck swiftly, a muted sound of tires deflating. The driver, likely the third, most dangerous accomplice, was caught completely off guard, attempting to scramble out of the cab only to be immediately secured. Inside the mill, the confrontation with the two men who ran the ghost hour was short and decisive. We heard a brief, frantic commotion, the sound of a table or perhaps a stack of crates crashing, followed by the muffled, angry shouts of the handlers. Then, two distinct, sharp sounds, the snap of handcuffs. The resistance was over in a matter of minutes, overwhelmed by the speed and precision of the task force. A profound, exhausted silence settled back over the feed mill. It was the silence of victory, a peace that came only after the immediate threat was neutralized. The bare light bulb over the loading dock remained, now illuminating the figures of several officers securing the perimeter. Ava and I exchanged a trembling, quiet high five. We had done it. Our information, our tireless work, and Ava's crucial last-minute observation had led to a clean, successful takedown of the racket's operational base, but the most important part of the mission remained: the pets. We watched, hearts pounding, as the officers began the meticulous, painstaking process of sweeping the massive, dark building. Slowly, methodically, they started bringing out the cages. One by one, the shapes emerged into the yellow glow of the dock light. Small cages, large wire crates, even a couple of bird carriers. The sight of these containers, now safe, but still holding frightened, confused animals, was overwhelming. I focused my binoculars intensely on the dock, searching for that familiar, magnificent splash of ginger fur. It was almost 5 minutes of agonizing waiting, watching various dogs, parrots, and smaller cats being carefully loaded into official transport vehicles. Finally, an officer emerged carrying a medium-sized plastic carrier. In the momentary clarity of the dock light, I saw him, curled tightly against the back wall of the cage, looking disheveled, dusty, and thoroughly indignant. Marmalade. The wave of relief that washed over me was so intense it was nearly nauseating. I squeezed Ava's hand so hard she winced. He was safe. Our boy was safe. We continued to watch as the officers carried out what looked like an entire inventory of stolen pets. The total count, judging by the number of cages loaded, must have been dozens. This wasn't just a handful of neighborhood pets. This was a massive operation spanning possibly several counties, all funneling animals to this single abandoned mill. They weren't just saving our pets, they were dismantling a major link in the illegal research supply chain. As the sun began to hint at its arrival, painting the eastern sky with faint, cool colors, the task force commander, a stern-faced woman in a tactical jacket, stepped out of the mill. She directed one of her officers to take photographs of the blue van and the disabled pickup, meticulously documenting the crime scene. It was time for us to leave. We had witnessed the success. We had seen Marmalade. Our presence any longer would only complicate the situation and might compromise Mr. Harrison's efforts to keep us anonymous. We slipped away from our thicket, moving silently back toward the main road. The feeling was surreal, a mixture of exhaustion, elation, and the profound anticlimax that follows intense danger. We had been playing detectives, but in the final hour, we had stepped into a very real, very dangerous criminal environment. We made the long walk back to the highway exit, the rising sun casting our shadows long and thin. We didn't speak much. We didn't need to. We had shared a secret adventure that few people would ever experience. Our shared mission had not only brought Marmalade home, but had forged an unbreakable bond between a 20-year-old on the cusp of adulthood and her spirited, smart 15-year-old sister. When we finally got back to our neighborhood and crept into the house, we found our parents, predictably, waking up. We looked disheveled, but they thankfully chalked it up to a classic teenage all-nighter with friends. We knew, however, that the story we carried was far more important than any teenage escapade. Marmalade was coming home, and we were the ones who had made it happen. The quiet chaos of the morning was replaced by the warm, sunlit relief of the afternoon. After our harrowing pre-dawn adventure and the quick necessary shower to wash off the dust and fear, Ava and I were exhausted, but too wired for sleep. We waited. The task force, led by Mr. Harrison's decisive action, had done their work, and now the complex machinery of official process was turning. The call finally came just after lunch. It was Mr. Harrison, his voice sounding tired but satisfied. He confirmed the arrests of the 3 men, the seizure of the blue van, the escape truck, and the dismantling of the biotech logistics supply chain. The mill was officially a crime scene. Most importantly, he confirmed that Marmalade was safe. He explained that all the recovered pets were being temporarily housed and vetted at an animal control facility associated with the task force, a place where their health could be checked and their identities matched to the crime reports. He told us that as soon as the initial paperwork was completed, we could come and retrieve him. The drive to the facility was agonizingly slow, a journey of anticipation that felt longer than the entirety of the stakeout. Our parents finally briefed with a carefully edited version of events, one that credited an anonymous tip to Mr. Harrison, but omitted our pre-dawn presence, were a mix of outrage over the crime and overwhelming relief. When we finally arrived, the facility was a scene of quiet, organized activity. We were ushered into a clean, sterile room where several dozen recovered pets were being cared for. The air was filled with a nervous cacophony of gentle whines, soft meows, and the occasional confused bird call. And then we saw him. An animal control officer brought Marmalade's carrier into the room. He was sitting up, finally, looking less defeated and more profoundly annoyed. His beautiful ginger fur was slightly matted, and his eyes, usually blazing with disdain, were wide with confusion and a touch of fear. The officer opened the cage, and for a long, silent moment, Marmalade didn't move. He just stared at the 3 of us, Mom, Ava, and me, as if deliberating whether our presence was worth the effort of movement. Then, with a hesitant stretch, he stepped out. I knelt down, calling his name softly, my voice thick with emotion. He didn't rush. He walked slowly, his gait a little stiff, inspecting my outstretched hand with the detached caution of an intelligence officer checking for bugs. Then he rubbed his head hard against my leg, a silent, powerful affirmation of recognition and relief. It was the most affectionate display of his life. Ava was already on the floor, gently stroking his back. We didn't need to speak. The reunion was a silent testament to the bond we had risked everything for. It wasn't just a cat. It was a living, breathing part of our family, returned from a harrowing ordeal. We spent the next hour talking to the task force commander, the same stern-faced woman we had seen at the mill, who was now marginally less stern. She confirmed the scale of the operation. Over 50 pets recovered, destined for illegal research facilities across the state. She praised the precision of the anonymous tip, meaning our information through Mr. Harrison, and noted that the quick neutralization of the second vehicle was critical. She told us that the meticulous nature of the evidence we provided was instrumental in securing the warrants. Mr. Harrison joined us wearing a wry smile. He had, he admitted, pulled a few strings to ensure the news coverage focused on the stolen commerce and corporate fraud angle, which guaranteed the swift, high-level prosecution of the handlers and the shell company, Biotech Logistics. He knew that the dramatic pet rescue narrative would follow naturally, but the legal case needed to be built on financial crime. The next day, the local news was abuzz with the story. The headline spoke of a pet ransom ring busted and Metropolitan Task Force dismantles animal smuggling operation. Willow Creek, previously known only for its quiet lawns, was suddenly famous. Neighbors flocked to our house, bringing small gifts and expressing profound gratitude. Mrs. Henderson was overjoyed to have her beagle, Barnaby, back, and the Smith's dog, Buster, was bouncing with energy, oblivious to his brief incarceration. The outpouring of appreciation was warm, but the real reward was the quiet understanding between Ava and me. The adventure had stripped away the superficial layers of our sisterly relationship, my studious reserve and her teenage impatience, and revealed the core of our strength as a unit. We realized we possessed a complementary set of skills, my analytical rigor and careful planning, combined with Ava's fearless directness and remarkable ability to improvise. Marmalade settled back into his routine almost immediately, demanding his breakfast with renewed vigor, though he spent the next few days in my lap, purring with an intensity that suggested he was making up for lost time. But the experience left a quiet mark on us. We had seen a glimpse of the real world, the cold calculation of organized crime, and we knew that beneath the peaceful facade of Willow Creek, deeper, darker realities existed. We had solved the pet racket, but the victory felt solemn. It wasn't just a mystery solved, it was a lesson learned about vigilance, justice, and the fierce protective love we felt for our ginger tyrant. The summer was forever changed, marked by the silence of the pre-dawn raid and the profound purr of our returned companion. The weeks following the great pet racket bust were characterized by a return to normalcy, albeit a normalcy permanently altered by the intensity of our shared secret. Marmalade's presence was a constant purring reminder of the danger we had faced and the triumph we had earned. He became even more demanding, perhaps sensing his elevated status as the central figure in a neighborhood legend, completely unaware that he was also the anchor that had plunged Ava and me into the world of espionage. The investigation continued quietly in the background. Biotech Logistics was shuttered, its key operatives facing serious federal charges related to interstate commerce fraud and theft. Mr. Harrison, our brilliant, grumpy ally, kept us minimally informed, occasionally dropping by with a cryptic newspaper clipping or a brief, satisfied nod. He was protective of us, ensuring our names remained out of the official report, preserving our anonymity while quietly elevating us to the status of his unofficial consultants. The biggest, most lasting change was the subtle but profound shift in the dynamic between Ava and me. Before the disappearance of Marmalade, we were sisters defined by the gap of 5 years. I, the slightly condescending student, and she, the eye-rolling teenager. Now that gap was bridged by a shared, dangerous experience. I looked at Ava differently. I no longer saw just the impatient, music-obsessed 15-year-old. I saw the formidable strategist who had deduced the ghost hour, the fearless diplomat who had charmed Mr. Jenkins, and the quick-witted operative who had spotted the third escape vehicle. Her resourcefulness was a force of nature, and I realized that my own analytical skills were significantly enhanced by her spontaneous, fearless action. We developed a unique, almost telepathic understanding. A quick glance across the breakfast table could convey volumes, a shared memory of the mill, a silent acknowledgement of a strange car parked too long, or a wry comment about a police siren. We had an invisible badge of honor, a secret history that bound us more closely than family ever could. Our basement command center, however, began its slow return to being a mere storage space. The poster board with the map, covered in circles and arrows, was carefully taken down and stashed away in a protective tube, preserved like an ancient scroll. We kept the dark jackets and the heavy flashlights, not for future mischief, but as relics of a time when we had become something more than sisters. We had become partners. I often found myself contemplating the chilling motive behind the racket. The idea that animals cherished and loved in one home could be viewed merely as fungible commodities for research deeply unsettled me. It gave a dark edge to the peaceful routines of our neighborhood. The world, I realized, was not always a safe, predictable place. Vigilance was not paranoia. It was a necessity. My own trajectory changed slightly, too. My college studies suddenly felt less abstract. The experience had given me a hunger for truth and justice, a sense of real-world utility that academic pursuits often lacked. I began to look at my literature studies through a new lens, recognizing the patterns of human behavior, the greed, the vulnerability, and the heroism that fueled our real-life drama. Ava, perhaps more visibly affected, seemed to mature overnight. She was still a whirlwind of teenage energy, but her focus was sharper. She started taking a genuine interest in local politics and community action, often volunteering to help the animal control facility that had housed Marmalade and the other rescued pets. She understood that while the immediate crime was solved, the deeper issue of animal welfare required constant, organized effort. One quiet evening, sitting on the porch swing, watching the sunset paint the sky the exact fiery color of Marmalade's fur, Ava broke a long silence. "Do you think they ever suspected it was us, Rose?" she asked, looking out at the street. I smiled, remembering the feeling of the cold, hard ground under the sumac bushes. The handlers? Number. They saw us as background noise. That was their biggest mistake, underestimating the quiet corners of the neighborhood and the girls who live in them. "Mr. Harrison knows," she corrected, a note of pride in her voice. "Mr. Harrison is a professional," I replied. "He knows enough to keep a good secret. And he knows how to appreciate a well-executed plan." I knew then that the adventure wasn't just about the rescue. It was about the affirmation of our capabilities. We had faced a genuine threat, used our wits, and achieved justice. It was a formative moment that defined the arc of my young adulthood and set Ava on a path of informed, determined action. We were no longer simply Rose and Ava. We were the duo who had cracked the Willow Creek pet racket. And that knowledge, that shared history, was the greatest treasure we had recovered. And so, my dear audience, that brings us to the conclusion of the summer of 1975. The summer a simple missing ginger cat turned a quiet suburban street into the backdrop for a serious, organized crime investigation. Sitting here today, looking back across 5 decades, the suspense and the fear of those sleepless nights feel distant, softened by the passage of time and the comfort of my armchair. Yet the lessons remain as clear and sharp as the moment we developed that crucial role of film. The immediate aftermath was, for a short while, exciting. The local paper ran a follow-up story detailing the arrests and the dismantling of biotech logistics. We learned that the individuals running the racket were indeed supplying several unscrupulous research entities, who were later heavily fined or shut down due to public outcry and regulatory action spurred by the scale of the thefts. We proved that justice, while slow, could be achieved through diligence and precision. The legacy of the pet racket was twofold. First, it profoundly changed our neighborhood. Willow Creek was shaken out of its complacent slumber. People became more watchful, more connected, and certainly more vigilant about the safety of their pets. It prompted the creation of a neighborhood watch group that, unlike most, actually stayed active for years, fueled by the memory of the missing animals. We understood that community protection wasn't about high fences. It was about shared awareness. Second, and far more importantly for me, it defined the course of my relationship with Ava. The teenage chasm that had separated us evaporated completely. We were bonded not just by blood, but by fire. When I finally left for college later that fall, our connection was stronger than ever. We realized our complementary strengths. My meticulous, analytical mind was balanced perfectly by her swift, decisive intuition. This partnership became a running theme in our lives. Later, when Ava pursued a career in law enforcement and advocacy, she often credited that summer and the discovery of the ghost hour as the moment she recognized her calling. As for me, the investigative impulse never truly faded. It manifested in a lifelong career teaching literature and history, where I specialized in tracing patterns and uncovering hidden narratives, not so different from following tire tracks in the dirt. Marmalade, the accidental catalyst for the entire adventure, lived a long, privileged life, ruling our household for another 12 years. He never forgot his ordeal, I believe. For the rest of his life, he exhibited a marked distrust of any vehicle that resembled a van and refused to eat any food presented to him in a plastic container. He remained our ginger hero, living proof that every great story needs a compelling, slightly demanding protagonist. I look back at my 20-year-old self, nervous, intellectual, and utterly unprepared, and I am proud. I am proud that we didn't wait for someone else to solve our problem. I'm proud that we listened to the tiny voice of suspicion and followed it all the way to a cold, dusty mill before dawn. This story, which began as a simple tale of a missing cat, is ultimately a testament to the power of curiosity, the strength of sisterhood, and the necessity of fighting for what you love. Never underestimate the heart of a 15-year-old girl with a mission, nor the quiet dedication of her older sister. Thank you, dear friends, for allowing me to share this piece of my history with you.